HMS Furious, originally designed as one of Admiral Fisher's large light cruisers. Unlike her half-sisters Courageous and Glorious, armed with two twin 15-inch turrets, Furious was to be armed with two single 18-inch guns. One of the major reasons for these large light cruisers was Admiral Fisher's Baltic Project, in which he desired to have ships with a low draft to be able to get close into shore. However, with Fisher out as First Sea Lord in 1915, the Royal Navy had to figure out what to do with these odd vessels. Due to Furious's numerous problems, especially her guns, she was a prime candidate for conversion into an aircraft carrier, leading to Furious playing a pivotal role in aircraft carrier development for the Royal Navy. Throughout her career, Furious had three major conversions to transform her into an aircraft carrier. The first installing a flying-off platform forward, and later another platform aft. Finally, in 1921, with the Royal Navy in need of more aircraft carriers, she was chosen again for conversion, this time to a more recognizable form. Unlike her half-sisters, Furious survived the Second World War and was eventually scrapped in 1954. We've talked about Fisher's Baltic Project in a few videos, and let's just say it had its impracticalities. Given that it banked on either destroying the high seas fleet in a decisive fleet action, or keeping them in port. Not to mention the mining of the Baltic coastline, and of course the difficulty of using the battleships near the Pomeranian coast, where the Royal Navy was to assist in the landing of a Russian army, at least according to Fisher. Something of note that should be mentioned is the term large light cruiser. I've used this term in videos before, and it's garnered some comments that were less than friendly, as yes, these ships could be called battle cruisers or light battle cruisers, as that's what John Roberts describes them as, and it's probably more appropriate. However, Admiral Fisher described them as large light cruisers when he was attempting to get the money allocated to build these ships, and so I tend to use that term to describe them, along with it being a bit more fun to say. Anyway, Furious was going to differ from her half-sisters in some ways. One major way was her armament, designed to have two single 18-inch guns and turrets fore and aft, instead of the two twin 15-inch turrets. With that, her original particulars were as follows. She would displace 19,200 tons with machinery for 90,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 31.5 knots, and two 18-inch guns with one and one turret forward and one aft, along with 8 later changed to 11 5.5-inch guns, 3 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 5 Maxim machine guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. Her armor layout was similar to the Courageous class, differing in the main deck thickness, having a maximum thickness of 1.75 inches. Given the light construction of these ships, they had a fair number of issues. Like during Courageous's trials in 1916, she sustained structural damage while working up to full speed against a rough sea. Given their specialized nature, and with Fisher out of the picture as First Sea Lord in 1915, the Royal Navy had to figure out something to do with these ships. Courageous and Glorious had some prospects to work with the Grand Fleet, but Furious, on the other hand, she was way too specialized. Her 18-inch guns were very slow firing, and it was not practical for fleet work. Where I should say that her forward 18-inch gun was built but never fitted, as we will soon see. In February 1917, as the Royal Navy continued to experiment with aircraft at sea, the Grand Fleet Aircraft Committee recommended that the still being fitted out Furious would be of more use being completed as an aircraft carrier. Since she would be able to embark a large number of aircraft and with her high speeds, be able to keep up with the battle fleet. Admiral David Beatty, now Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, who appointed this committee, gave some pushback saying that he wanted Furious to be complete to her original specifications. The committee felt that it was important to go through with this conversion as it would only remove her forward turret, and in its place, give her a forward flying-off platform. By July 4th, 1917, the ship was modified for this. With this partial conversion, Furious had a forward flying-off deck being 228 feet long, and depending on the part of the platform, 57 feet to 36 feet wide. The narrowest points were supported by steel girders, as the North Sea can be rather rough, and it was thought that they would support the deck. A hangar was built beneath the flight deck that would be able to carry about 10 aircraft. Those aircraft were lifted to the topside by lifts, and with some help from windbreakers, the aircraft were secured before takeoff on the topside. Initially, the aircraft could take off from Furious but could not land on her, with the pilots preferring to land in the water and be picked up later by boats and/or cranes. Using this forward flying-off platform, the Royal Navy began to experiment with Furious and began flying off trials in late July 1917, where we turn to Squadron Commander Edward Harris Dunning, part of the Royal Navy Air Service. He's been described as a brave, skilled, and resourceful pilot. He had been conducting experimental carrier flights at the Deck Landing Trials Unit at the Royal Navy Experimental Air Station Isle of Grain, near Sheerness in Kent. His commanding officer, Captain Wilmot Nicholson, gave his full support to the possibility of landing on the large takeoff deck of Furious, and that if he succeeded, he would prove that deck landings to be a practical solution instead of the so-called single shots that would be lost at the end of their sorties, increasing the potential of the air groups, and a demonstration would stimulate progress. The group consisted of Sopwith pups, an overall good aircraft. However, it seems it would have some difficulty with the landing process, where David Hobbs in British Aircraft Carriers Design, Development, and Service Histories writes this: attempting to land a Sopwith pup in front of the superstructure of a large warship was all the more remarkable when the aircraft's controls are fully explained. It had a very low wing loading, and any turbulence would cause the pilot to have to make constant adjustments to the primary flying controls. The 80 horsepower 9-cylinder engine was a rotary engine in which the cylinders rotated with the propellers about a fixed crankshaft. The rotating mass gave considerable torque and made left-handed turns easier to achieve than right. Also, the nose tended to rise when turning left, and drop when turning right. The latter was never a good thing close to the surface of the sea, and the two effects made left-handed circuits the preferred option. They have remained so ever since. The engine operated over a very narrow range of revolutions, basically on or off, and its manipulation needed to be as much part of the pilot's handling skill as the flying controls. Coupled with the factors Mother Nature was going to throw at him, Dunning had his work cut out for him. On August 2nd, 1917, Furious sailed for a gun direction exercise near an island south of Scapa Flow. When she completed these, Dunning was going to demonstrate the first deck landing by a naval pilot in an operational aircraft on an operational warship underway at sea, where again Hobbs writes, he flew a low left-hand circuit off the ship's port side, controlling his height with the elevators and speed with ignition switch while constantly adjusting the mixture of control. Furious steamed at 26 knots into a steady 21-knot wind, giving a wind over the deck of 47 knots from directly ahead. This was slightly higher than ideal, and meant that he would have to overtake the deck as he drew alongside, turning in close ahead of the port derrick and encountering cliff edge effect, as the wind was blowing upwards against the ship's side. Once over the center of the deck, Dunning would have centralized the controls and held the pup N6453 in a 3-point attitude about 10 feet over the deck, blipping the engine on and off to descend. He touched down at 11:10 on the hangar roof, at the widest part of the deck, and was held firmly in place by officers briefed to prevent the pup being blown over the side when it was lightened when he got out. The importance was widely recognized, and with several Grand Fleet senior officers aboard, it marked a true watershed moment for naval aviation. Unfortunately for Dunning, his success and luck came to an end on the 7th, just 5 short days later, when he attempted another landing and the aircraft was blown over the side, and with no crash boat in the water, it took Furious 20 minutes to get back to the position where the plane had gone over, and it was found that Dunning had been knocked unconscious due to the crash and unfortunately drowned. Dunning's demonstration led to recommendations from the C&C of the Grand Fleet that the aft 18-inch gun be removed and be replaced by a second flight deck intended for aircraft recoveries. The pilots who had flown on Furious opposed this change for several reasons. One of the major ones being the fear of turbulence after the bridge structure and funnel would make the approach from the rear dangerous, not to mention the hot gases from the funnel. Still, the Admiralty went through with their design changes, and an after-flight deck was fit with gangways being fit on each side of the funnel and superstructure to connect the landing and flying off decks. The aircraft complement increased by more than double. This conversion was complete by March 1918. In this refit, an arrestor gear was fit to the after landing deck, which was comprised of longitudinal steel hawsers stretched tight, ending at a ramp at the forward end of the flight deck. The Sopwith pups were fitted with skids instead of wheels with hooks on each side to catch the wires to prevent the aircraft from going over the side of the ship. A net was placed at the rear end of the funnel to prevent aircraft from flying into it, being replaced by vertical ropes. Landings were not easy as the superstructure and funnels were retained, with eddies occurring because of them. Also, those hot gases coming from the funnels. Few successful landings would occur with this hazardous setup, with most pilots choosing to land in the water to be picked up later by a crane rather than attempting to land on the deck, making Furious a takeoff-only aircraft carrier for the time being. In July of 1918, still serving as a flying-off platform, Furious became the first carrier to successfully deliver an air attack from a carrier on land-based targets when she launched 7 planes, which attacked Zeppelin sheds at Tondern. After the war, her future was somewhat in doubt, as she was laid up. The 2 flight deck arrangement with a central bridge and funnel had been a failure, but it was proposed that she be converted into a flush deck aircraft carrier and not keep her interesting configuration. So, in 1921, the director of naval construction, Eustace Tennyson Danecourt, decided to go through with the conversion. The conversion had called for the ship to be cleared down to the present hangar, and in its place, 2 large hangars would be built, one on top of the other. The lower hangar was an odd shape, containing workshops and offices. It was between 35 and 50 feet in width, and about 550 feet in length, while the upper hangar was 50 feet in width and 520 feet in length. Furious was supposed to be able to carry 60 aircraft, but in reality, she would carry no more than 36 at a time. 2 lifts served these hangars. These 2 lifts served multiple flying-off points on the decks with a length of about 340 feet. In the process, the funnel, superstructure, and mast were removed, and she was given a clear flight deck through most of the forward section, sloped slightly upward to help slow down the aircraft. The nose of the upper flight deck was rounded off as experiments showed that it provided better aerodynamic conditions. The original flying-off platform was retained as another takeoff platform and was intended for small fighters to be flown off from this lower deck. Safety nets would be provided on each side, and palisades, or more simply put, barricades, were added on to do the same job. Cranes were provided on the ship's rear so the ship could work with seaplanes. The considerable rise in freeboard caused concerns about the new height of the new hangars, with those in favor of it arguing that it would impact the design of new planes, as they would need to be smaller to fit the hangars. With that, the hangar size was a compromise. The higher freeboard exposed the ship to more wind surface, necessitating Furious to have heavier anchors and cables than would be required for a vessel of such size. Armor did not change much besides the addition of the 5/8 inch thick flight deck and underwater bulges similar to those found on Royal Oak. The navigation arrangements were fit to the fore end of the upper hangar, being duplicated on either side of the vessel, with a gangway connecting them. On the starboard side was the compass platform, where the captain and his designated officers commanded the ship. On the port side was the flying control position, where air operations were directed. Like Argus, she was fitted with a retractable chart house in the center of the flight deck. The armament was to consist of 5.5-inch guns, including 6 high-angle guns, as well as 3-pounders and machine guns. The machinery spaces remained where they were, but required new horizontal arrangements for the discharge of gases aft. This reconstruction took place between June 1921 and September 1925. As of 1925, she had a normal displacement of 22,500 tons, and her machinery remained the same, except for the refitting of equipment in 1931, where it remained generally the same, just newer. As of 1925 in her sea trials, she had the machinery for 90,600 shaft horsepower for a speed of 30 knots. Her armor arrangement was a main belt of 2 inches, bulkheads of between 2 and 3 inches, a protective deck of between a 1/4 inch and an inch, and a flight deck of 5/8 of an inch. Her armament as of 1925 was as previously mentioned, but in 1939, she was refit to have 12 4-inch high-angle guns, 4 pom-poms, 2 half-inch machine gun mountings, 4 3-pounders, and 4 machine guns. Although it was hoped that she'd be able to carry up to 60 aircraft at a time, in reality, it was more like 36, obviously depending on the period, as she would serve in various roles requiring different aircraft complements. In August and September 1925, she carried out her sea trials as an aircraft carrier. During these trials, smoke was ejected through the side openings, and the effect on the quarterdeck and hangars was very bad. This was solved in the hangar, at least, through the use of the fire curtain, with other operations being carried out smoothly, like the testing of hangar equipment. Earlier in the year, she carried out several flying-off trials with many different aircraft. The conclusions drawn from these trials showed that Furious would be a very capable platform for takeoff and landing operations. Throughout the interwar period, Furious carried several different aircraft combinations. One aircraft she carried often in her later career was the Fairey Swordfish. Throughout the 1920s, she carried different flight complements in her various stations with the Atlantic Fleet, undergoing a refit in Devonport mostly for her machinery that would last until February of 1932. After her machinery was worked up, she went on for a cruise with the Mediterranean Fleet. Like I mentioned, her air groups changed pretty frequently. For example, in 1933, Furious's air groups consisted of the 801st, 811th, and 822nd groups, where they flew Fairey Flycatchers, Hawker Nimrods, Hawker Ospreys, Blackburn Ripons, and Fairey 3Fs. She rejoined the ex-Atlantic Fleet and now Home Fleet in May of 1934, where she briefly joined the Mediterranean Fleet in October and then back to the Home Fleet. Between those years and the Second World War, she served as a training carrier and had some refits, notably in 1939 with the changing of her armament. With these new armaments, her forward flying-off platform would no longer be used, and the addition of a short island superstructure with an RDF aerial pole and a high-angle director on the starboard side flying off deck. When the Second World War broke out in September of 1939, she was based out of Rosyth, spending the first several months of the war escorting convoys to and from Halifax. During this time period, she carried a group of skuas and swordfish, where the swordfish made an attack run against a U-boat on September 22nd. Courageous attempted the same thing 5 days earlier as part of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's hunter-killer groups, in which she was sunk in the process of hunting submarines. In December, she sailed to and from Halifax to escort the first Canadian soldiers to Europe. Then in April 1940, after a short refit period, she operated in the Norwegian campaign, with her aircraft attacking German ships, even taking part in the Second Battle of Narvik. After operations in Norway, at the end of June, she carried gold across the Atlantic and returned with American aircraft. In the intervening time, her other half-sister, Glorious, had been sunk by the two German battleships of the Scharnhorst class. She returned to help in the Norwegian campaign, where her aircraft struck coastal targets in Norway before carrying out Operation Stripe, where she ferried aircraft several times to West Africa between November and January of 1941. She was attacked by bombers but would not sustain any serious damage. Then she spent the next several months taking aircraft to Gibraltar and on to Malta. She also carried out anti-shipping operations in August of 1941 and later went on to the USA for a refit. Seeing how her wartime service consisted of ferrying aircraft over long distances, her machinery was getting quite strained. Upon arrival in the United States in October 1941, she was refitted, and when that was completed, she was sent on to Clyde in the United Kingdom for more upgrades. New British equipment and the like, also upgrades to her light anti-aircraft battery. Her first mission after being refit was another ferrying operation to Malta in August 1942, Operation Pedestal, doing this a couple more times before assisting the landings for Operation Torch, where her aircraft successfully struck Vichy French aircraft still on the ground in their hangars, retiring to Gibraltar only after about a day because her assistance wasn't necessary. She joined Force H and continued her operations on the African coast until February 1943, spending a short maintenance period, and then took part in several anti-shipping operations with the Home Fleet, and attacking German positions in Norway to distract from the Allied invasion of Sicily. Another notable operation is her aircraft attacking German shipping in the Norwegian fjords on June 1, 1944. She and Victorious helped to sink two large merchant vessels. This was followed up by an attack on Tirpitz on July 17th, where smoke screens obscured the target and prevented good bombing. But with ample warning, the Germans were able to deploy smoke screens. She then took part in mining operations off of Norway until September of 1944, when she was paid off and joined the Reserve Fleet in April of 1945. Following the war, she was used for several things, including target practice, eventually being scrapped in 1954. Originally designed to assist in Admiral Fisher's Baltic Project, but seeing how she was not suited for battle fleet work, she was transformed into an aircraft carrier with several unique configurations. In this role as an aircraft carrier, she served the Royal Navy for a very long time. I hope you all enjoyed this look at the various conversions and career of HMS Furious. She's a rather interesting ship, and I think purely for her unique looks, she's my favorite Royal Navy carrier. Until next time, my friends, good luck this week, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow.